What's up, Internet? We're live again on, I don't even have a name for this, the Docker Show, the Container Show, Docker Late Night Docker. I've tried Late Night Docker, but that only makes sense if it's night for me. So some of you, it's probably night. Some of you, it's probably early AM. That's the difficulty and awesomeness of being on the Internet live. So I just got back from New York City. I spent a week at O'Reilly Velocity Conference and, of course, doing some really fun stuff in New York. I'll be talking about that actually in a newsletter. We'll talk about how to get newsletters and all that stuff later. But lots of stuff happened at Velocity, lots of cool stuff. I've got some announcements to make from Velocity. I've got a lot of stuff that I learned, obviously. I love cloud conferences. Distributed computing conferences, and that's really O'Reilly Velocity's focus is sort of turning your monoliths into cloud native, going microservices, going containers, going hybrid computing with things on premise and in the cloud. Lots of cool stuff there. Leaders of the industry that I get to hang out with. It's just so much fun to see people. And I was there for a 2-day workshop. I was there doing a Docker workshop and a Swarm workshop. So it was really great to see both, people that are doing new software projects and also people that are in enterprises with huge multi-decade applications. They're trying to figure out how to run in containers and how to run those at scale. So it was a lot of fun to talk to people. I learned a lot as always, and I have lots to share. So this week, I thought I would make the clickbaity title of Swarm versus Kubernetes because that is one of the most popular questions I get. I teach Swarm, and I've been working on a Kubernetes course. And if you haven't been around our chat talking about what's going on in the community, I have been working on plans for one, didn't actually have a locked-in schedule. And I have an announcement video that's probably about a week away that's going to come out with some more details in my newsletter, as well as if you're a member of any of my courses, you'll be getting that here soon. So expect that next week. And I also will have some surprises in there about who's going to be involved with that project. I'm very excited. Also wanted to talk about Docker for Node.js. That's my upcoming course here. I don't have a launch date, but somewhere in the next month or two, Docker for Node.js. If you are a Node and JavaScript fan, this course is going to be focused exclusively for you. And it's not about Docker 101, right? We already do Docker 101 on Docker Mastery. But this is more about if you're a professional working on Node projects and you want the absolute best experience with containers and Node, that's what this is going to be about. It's going to be a shorter project-based training, so it's going to focus on taking example projects in Node, working apps. Some of them are going to be simple, like a Hello app, and maybe some Node stuff like Express servers or a Ghost blog, something like that. And then we're going to go to a more complicated multi-tier setup. How do you do that in Docker Compose? How do you do that in persistent storage in the cloud? How do you do that in Swarm? And we might be adding in some stuff at the end that you maybe something around Kubernetes, maybe something around multi-cloud. It might be some cool stuff. So stay tuned for that as well. I've got a bunch of questions from everyone so far, so that's great. I'm going to start answering those in a minute. But I thought I would talk a little bit about an interesting trend that I'm seeing, and you all have probably talked about or heard about Kubernetes, and you probably have may or may not seen some of my answers on the internet about Kubernetes. I talk about it extensively. I mentioned it. It's probably a weekly question here on this topic, on this channel. I have an AMA on GitHub. If you follow me on GitHub, you know that I have a repo called AMA in there as well, where people ask me questions, and I answer them most of the time if I have an answer. And it's an interesting conversation that I don't think is going away. Now, I am not one to necessarily pit one technology against another, especially when we're talking about open source, because quite often, people that are working on one project in open source are related or working on other projects in open source. I work inside the Swarm and Docker community as well as the Kubernetes community because they're all really one large community to me. I see the same people working in them, using the software, helping make the software. So I don't like to do a versus. But what I do like to talk about is strategy and what's right for you and your team, because it's all different. This is the same thing we deal with at every level of scale, right? If you're on small projects and you only need a few servers, and maybe you're a scrappy little project startup, maybe you have low funding, or you just don't simply need enterprise scale, maybe something like DigitalOcean is your right hoster in the cloud. Or maybe something is more complicated and more security focused like Azure or AWS. But those require more complexity, they require more effort. And so I don't prefer one over the other for any specific project. I have clients in all three. I just know that the simpler tools are really great for simple projects. The complicated tools, while often have way more features and complexity to them, they're also more work. And so if you are like me, and a lot of times I'm a what I call solo DevOps. Solo DevOps is a real thing for a lot of us. Some of us, we only work in big projects on big teams. So those choices are going to be different. And I do believe those choices are also different in your orchestrator. So we will talk about that, and people will ask me those questions. We'll talk about that in the chat today. But if you have any questions about that stuff, as you're on your Docker and container journey, throw those in the chat. We'll get to them as we go along, and let's get started. So before I get started, though, I want to mention that all this stuff is available. This is a big sort of decision I had to make last week. We're going to start publishing these AMAs in my channel. So even if you missed them or if you want to reference sections of them, I'm going to start releasing them. We haven't figured out exactly everything yet, because what I would really like to do is to pinpoint you specific questions so that I can reference them, little clicks that you can take directly to the answer to a question. That would be really cool, specifically because some of these episodes are focused on one topic or another. Haven't figured out all the details of that yet, but stay tuned. Again, either on the newsletter or in my courses, either one of those, you'll get the announcements on that stuff. So Lee, hello, Lee. Nice to see you. Yes, we're going to start soon. Santosh asking if we're going to start soon. Absolutely. I'm always a few minutes late. In fact, I was thinking of getting a t-shirt that says always late because no matter how much I tried to be on time, just getting back from New York City last night, I had technical difficulties with my camera setup and things that were not a problem last week. So I wasn't quite ready at the last second there. By the way, if you hear any sort of audio problems or if anything's technically messed up, I can't always tell from my end. So let me know if the volume is too loud or distorted or if it's too quiet. That'll always help me make sure that these go well. So Lee's back. Can you talk about RBAC on Kubernetes? Well, we're getting to hard questions right up front. Let's see if Lee... yeah. Hightower once mentioned, this is a Rob Christensen comment. Hightower once commented that RBAC is a rabbit hole that you don't want to go down if you don't have to. So, all right. So I think what he was talking about is a lot of us that advise others on Kubernetes is that Kubernetes is a layer of the infrastructure, right? So it is not, I do not advise rolling completely hand-created open source Kubernetes without higher level tooling to manage a lot of that, unless you have a deep team. And what I mean by deep is like at least 3 full-time DevOps people. That's actually, from a friend of mine, one of the other Docker captains, recommended that's what they suggest to their consulting clients. And I kind of like that number, is that if you're a single DevOps person, or more importantly, if you don't have most of your time and a spare other person to help you with Kubernetes, then you want a higher level tool. And what I mean by that is you want to roll out Docker Enterprise Edition, or you want to roll out maybe one of the cloud ones, like one of the higher level tools in AWS, or maybe you want to roll out Rancher, the Rancher Kubernetes version. All of these tools layer out the RBAC, and if for those of you who don't know, that's really about the authentication role-based access control. That's about making sure that different people have different permissions at different layers of your stack. And so with Docker, if you remember, out of the box, Docker provides you just all or nothing. It doesn't really have a login system built in. And so even if you're just doing a single server Docker, there are other tools you can put on top of that. With Swarm, Swarm has now what's called authorization plugins, and there's multiple ones of those. As well as Kubernetes. Kubernetes comes out of the box with an RBAC model, but it doesn't provide you those high-level tools to make it easy to add users, manage users, delete users. So you really, I recommend, want to without doing everything manually at the command line and starting from nothing. If you use a higher level tool, then you get a lot out of the box. For instance, if you do Docker Enterprise, obviously a paid tool, that's going to give you a model right out of the box to manage the Kubernetes permissions and the Swarm permissions, because it does both, right out of the box, and it won't require you to hand custom build everything. And that's really what I think what Kelsey is talking about is you want a tool that solves a lot of those problems for you. So look to those higher level tools to manage them. If you're on Azure, I'm not an expert on Azure Kubernetes yet, but I'm going to guess that Azure is going to use Azure's existing authentication model on top of Kubernetes. With like Docker Enterprise, you get a built-in authentication management system in the GUI, and that actually will extend to LDAP, so you can do things like Active Directory and other LDAP systems, Open LDAP. So I would say go look at those. That's really what you want to look at. I don't have a preference because they kind of all do the same stuff, and I'm quite frankly not an expert in all of them to compare or contrast. So that's what you want to look at, not necessarily just using the toolkit out of the open source repos. Again, with Kubernetes, it was never meant to be a single repo that you just deployed anyway. It's a set of tools that are designed for you to layer or buy or use higher level tools on top of it to create something like a container solution. Swarm is a little different in that way, where Swarm is really meant to be used right out of the box. It is an application deployment solution right out of the box from the CLI, one-liner install on each server, and then from there you can instantly start deploying containers. You already have encryption and disk. You already have all the things you need. That's the great thing about Swarm, easy to use, easy to get started. Kubernetes, much larger product that solves a much larger problem set, and you really need those higher level tools on top of that. So usually if I was going to tell someone like you're new to Kubernetes, I wouldn't even say go download the repo. I would say maybe take some courses. I don't have one yet, but maybe take a course or two to learn the fundamentals, but then immediately go start looking at high level tools to learn how to deploy it and manage it. Because if you go and learn Docker Enterprise for Edition, and then you decide to do, something in Azure or Amazon, those tools are going to operate completely differently. So you may not be able to compare and contrast those tools. Great questions, though. Sorry, I don't have an easy button for that one, but there's not a whole lot of easy buttons in Kubernetes right now. I like to use Docker with clients, and I'm looking to make as quick to set up as new services as Heroku. So this is a question from Rob. Hi, Rob. Are there examples like this, possibly with Docker machines? So Heroku is an application deployment solution. Interestingly enough, Docker, the company before Docker, was called .cloud, and they were going after Heroku to compete with it, and they didn't. They ended up not really winning. So after years of work, they actually just took all their open source tools or their infrastructure tools that they used to build kind of the Kubernetes competition. I'm sorry, not Kubernetes. The Heroku competition, and they open sourced them, and that became the Docker project. So essentially, Docker came out of the idea of what if we could do Heroku differently. So on Heroku, my experience with deploying containers is that it is not a great platform for running containers. You can totally do it. It has its own registry. You can deploy containers with it, but you lose some of the automated functionality that makes Heroku great for application deployments. For instance, you can't do automated CI and building of your images in Heroku. So then you now automatically need an external CI tool like Travis or Jenkins or CodeShip, something like that. And then that takes away part of the functionality and the auto shipping features of Heroku. So already out of the box, you're now losing value out of doing Heroku, because Heroku is more expensive than just a random server like an EC2 server or a DigitalOcean server. So at this moment in time, I would advise people, like, if you're going to go all containers, Heroku is not really the platform, in my opinion, to focus on. I would focus more either on building my own container solution in one of the major clouds like DigitalOcean, Azure, Amazon, or I would maybe use some of the tools that are existing and are coming out in those, like on AWS, you got ECS, stuff like that. Heroku is a really cool platform, but once you start using containers, it becomes less valuable. So I hate to tell you not to do containers, because I feel like that's a step back if you're already planning on doing containers locally for local development. But the last I did, and this was this year. The last I checked and tried on Heroku, the container deployment tools weren't all there, so I had to start bringing in other tools to get all of the automation that you usually get out of the box with Heroku. Also, didn't get a lot of all the monitoring stuff that I was used to getting out of the box, I think. So I hope that helps. If you have more questions on that, Rob, go ahead and ask them in the chat. I'll get to them when we get there. Again, I'm not disparaging Heroku. It's a great deployment solution. It's a great, I have it probably a half a dozen projects that I'm related to on that system, but it's not a first-class citizen for containers. In fact, if you're actually looking for that, let me look up the tool real quick. There is another hoster that, let me pull this up here. Hyper. So hyper.sh, I will throw this in chat. Hyper.sh is trying to be a little bit like Heroku for containers, and they're pretty slick. They do some pretty cool stuff. So let me, there's other ones out there, but Hyper is one that I think is taking that approach of easy command line tools, easy deployment solutions, stuff like that. I'm also excited about DigitalOcean's upcoming Kubernetes beta, which they're now launching the open beta so that more people can get into it here in October. So we'll see, because DigitalOcean traditionally makes things very, very easy for developers. So I'm hoping that they will provide an easy path to Kubernetes versus some of the other clouds that are maybe a little more complicated. All right. And yeah, Docker Machine does not work with Heroku because Heroku, again, abstracts away machines. You can't create VMs on Heroku. It's at the app level, a higher level. So if you're using Docker Machine, you probably want to use something like DigitalOcean. If you're looking to use something like Heroku, which is easy, but not sort of traditional enterprise, the closest thing to that for machines with Docker Machine is DigitalOcean, in my opinion. An overview of container debuggers and how to choose. So this is Alyaz. I'm not sure if I said that correctly, if that was your name. So hello. An overview of container debuggers or how to choose. All right, so I'm not sure how to answer this question because I'm not sure what you're referring to as container debuggers. So a container, again, is just a wrapper of a few primitive features in Linux, like namespaces and C groups that really just make an application security boundaried, right? So, and then it gives limited access to certain resources for it. So I don't see a lot of people debugging containers per se. What you really, I think that maybe the question you're asking is, how do I attach my existing debuggers into containers to debug my app? And that, like, especially for local development, right? And that is actually a topic of my upcoming Docker for Node.js course, is how do I get my debugger properly working inside the container? And for that, you just need to make sure that the debugger that is running in your app is running on a TCP port and does not expect a native connection or a socket connection, something like that. You really want it to be TCP connections. And as long as you open up that port and then you take your IDE or your shell or whatever you're using to attach the debugger and making sure that it knows to attach to localhost if you're on Docker for Mac or Docker for Windows. So I would say, if that's what if you're talking about, great. If you're talking more general troubleshooting, then maybe refine your question a little bit in the Q&A in YouTube, and I will re-answer the question if that's more what you're looking at. But in general, I don't see a lot of people having container-specific debuggers. I'm not sure. That may be a thing, but I've not seen it. So, Carrie, do you have any news about Linux containers on Windows Server? So, hello, Carrie or Kari. I'm not sure how you would say that, but I think it's Carrie. So, Linux in Windows Server. So, Windows Server 2016 was the first version of Windows Server to even support containers, but it only supports Windows containers. So, right now, even to get the latest features, you got to get of Docker, you need to do the sort of command line only Windows servers, which are 1709 or 1803 versions. So I'm assuming you know Windows Server versioning has changed and that we have these new builds where Windows Server 2016 is sort of the GUI traditional long lifecycle thing, and that's not getting the updates like these new editions are of Windows Server. So now, if you're going to run cloud or servers that you want the latest of all these features, like 1803 has, you're going to want to download that and run 1803. That's going to get you the latest stuff. So if you're talking about Linux in Hyper-V, that has worked in all three of those, so that you're running Linux VMs in Hyper-V, and then you can run Linux containers on that. But if you're talking about running Linux natively on Windows Server, that doesn't actually exist that I'm aware of yet, because that would require the Linux kernel, which is not in Windows Server. Now, you might be confused a little bit with some of the things that are going on Windows 10, where Windows 10 now has a lot of cool features around running Windows containers and Linux kit containers or Linux containers side by side. That is a new thing with the latest updates on Windows 10 that you can do. That only is really about Windows 10, and what it's really doing in the background is running VMs on your behalf in Hyper-V on Windows 10. So it's more about the workflow and automation of getting that to work. It's not really running Linux native on Windows Server. It's sort of hiding the fact that it's still running a Hyper-V VM and giving the container a mini Linux OS. So if that's helping you, answering your questions on how that is all laid out, ideally, if you're running Linux containers, you're going to have to run a Linux server, and so if you're Windows shop, you're going to probably do that in Hyper-V. So yes, totally do that. I recommend that. Otherwise, if you have more specific questions on Linux on Windows Server, please ask again in chat, and I will get to those when I come back around. So one second. All right, next question. Hello, Hound. How are you? Crisp Pyro or Crispy? It's hard to tell. So I'll assume Chris. I know big app stacks are meant to run in Swarm and K8s, but what about a smaller stack like WordPress, MariaDB, and Nginx containers load balancing? Is that something that would fit in a cluster? So absolutely, Chris. You would. So I think Swarm is the sweet spot for running small little things like that, even if it's on one server. So I'm going to switch screens a little bit and jump so I can show you some websites and some examples of this stuff, because people ask me these questions a lot. So here we go to the green screen. All right. You should be seeing my screen now, and my mic is working. All right. So Hyper was something I mentioned earlier. This is a sort of a container hosting platform. You can check them out. And I don't have any sort of codes I don't yet for referral of free credits or anything like that, but I'll look into that. So I would love if somebody to check it out. Tell me if you like it. Tell me if it makes sense to you, if you would use that. I don't have any customers using them yet, but I have played around with them a few times, and I'm just curious if people are looking for some solution like that. So for a lot of this stuff that you're going to see today, you're going to jump onto my website, brettfisher.com/docker. That's the best links to my courses. That is the links to all of my workshops information, all the workshops that I just are having. By the way, I'm going to be in London. If you're in Europe, I'm going to be in London in a month doing another workshop at O'Reilly Velocity. That'll be a 2-day workshop on Docker and Swarm. And then you can follow me on all the things on there, as well as a bunch of my free videos. There's hours and hours of free Docker videos on there, including parts of my courses that I've put available for free on YouTube. This Ask Me Anything that you're watching now. And then most importantly, for any of you that are looking at orchestration and going production, I highly recommend my 2 DockerCon talks, because they were designed for people going production for the first time, getting started in production. How do you make decisions around a lot of those tools? And so those 2 talks are from 2017 and 2018. I'll be doing that again in DockerCon 2018 EU in Barcelona in December. So look to see an update to those because I'll be doing some new stuff there, as well as some other tools and links to documentation and open source projects I work on. A lot of those are sample projects for Docker. So anyway, so that's brettfisher.com/Docker. And the question that Chris asked was around, yes. Oh, it just moved on me. So small projects. So yes, I would say Swarm. In fact, on my Ask Me Anything, which you can look me up on GitHub. And so github.com/brettfisher/AMA is my sort of offline Ask Me Anything when people aren't watching me live on YouTube. And on there, if you search on Swarm and Compose, I believe, there is one of my favorite questions. One host for production. Should I use Docker Compose or a single node Swarm? So that is issue 8. I will put that link in chat because I think single node swarms are awesome. They solve a problem that you would have with maybe one server is I don't need fault tolerance at the hardware level because that's not maybe the project I'm working on. And it's a small company, a small client, or it's just a hobby. But I want things like health checks that will detect if my app is failing and recycle it, recreate it if it crashes. I want my secrets to be stored encrypted in a encrypted database. I want to be able to have the potential to easily add a second node later or a third node and have some level of hardware fault tolerance for my app. Those are all things you can get out of the box with a single node Swarm. It still uses the same compose files as Docker Compose. So this is one of the big reasons why I don't recommend using the Docker Compose command line in production, because Swarm works in a lot of ways even better. So I actually give a bunch of reasons there. Check that one out. That's one of my favorites. And of course, always throw in your comments if you agree, if you disagree, why you chose to either follow my advice or not. I love getting feedback because it really helps me understand if people's needs are changing or if I'm even steering you in the right direction. So hopefully that helps. I would say absolutely yes. Start locally with Docker Compose, Chris, and then as you get that working well in a single Compose file locally, try doing that in a single node Swarm. You can even do that on your own machine by just taking one of my courses and learning about Swarm and then creating a single node Swarm. A 3-node Swarm by default, using all the default settings, operates almost exactly like a 1-node Swarm. So you don't really need to, if you're just playing around and making sure things function correctly, you don't need to scale to 3 nodes yet. You can really do that with just a single node. And then when you want to test real production stuff and tearing servers down, seeing if it still survives, you can do that with 3 servers in the cloud. All right, the cluster cast. Oh, don't know what that was in response to, Rob. Sorry, the cluster cast. Or is that what this is? Oh, I get it. I'm a little slow sometimes. So yes, the cluster cast. We should call it that. So Rob's back with Swarm versus K8s is a very important topic, though. People conclude that K8s is only good choice based on Google search results. Yeah, so Rob, that's the problem with marketing. So here's an interesting thing that's happening in the container ecosystem space with Swarm versus Kubernetes, is we're all jumping on board the excitement and of Kubernetes, the project. And that is legitimate, right? Like developers try it. If they like it and they use it and they're successful, then they're going to talk about it, right? The thing that's happening, though, with Kubernetes that's different than Swarm was Swarm is open sourced by Docker, but a lot of the other companies didn't feel like they could make money on it. So there's not a lot of third-party tooling and marketing around marketing Swarm, because really the companies that are providing third-party services to Swarm are either open source themselves, so they're not doing a lot of marketing, or they are providing add-ins to Docker that maybe aren't going to generate a whole lot of money. That, like Portworx, for example, provides data replication for Docker and Swarm. And they talk about it on their website, but they're not a really big company. What is happening in Kubernetes, though, is that because of the huge amount of developers that are interested in that, we basically have this sort of circle of chatter. I call it sort of like living in the bubble, where all the companies that are in tech that want to make money are realizing if they make something for Kubernetes, they may be able to make some money on it. And since there's so many people in that community, they're going to chat it up. So now what you're seeing is that when you're on the first few pages of GitHub, you're seeing news and all this stuff because they know that you will read it if they talk about it, or you will be interested potentially in their company and their products if they say they do something in Kubernetes. In fact, a lot of times I see companies that say, we have a Kubernetes thing, and it really just means that they do containers that happen to work in Kubernetes, but they didn't really make anything for Kubernetes. But they're marketing to that audience, right? So then we generate this bubble of an echo chamber of that. And that's not always a bad thing, but what it does is it gives us a perception that is not the same as reality. So in my courses and when I talk to people at conferences, the sad fact is most of the people that I talk to, over 50%, I'm not doing scientific studies here or anything, but I feel like over half the people that I talk to, when I ask, why did you choose Kubernetes over Swarm or Mesos or whatever, the answer is, my boss told me to. Not, we did a technical analysis of the features we needed, and then we decided, based on our evaluation of 3 different products, that this one would meet our needs the best. That didn't happen. They were just simply a buzzword type of VP maybe that said, we've got to do Kubernetes in our shop, and so the person's using that. I have met people that were sold on the idea of Kubernetes as an easy thing to do for a single person and then realized later that it was just too much work for them, so they actually backed out of the Kubernetes project, went Swarm, or maybe just went pure ECS on AWS, or maybe didn't even do container orchestration at all because their project didn't actually meet the needs of what an orchestrator could solve. And so right now we had this mythical, what I consider sort of the mythical level of excitement around Kubernetes. And the reality is not always meeting that mythical unicorn status. So I'm not pointing out that you shouldn't use it. I'm saying be careful and realize that when you're out there in the ecosystem, not everyone's talking about the bugs, the problems, all that. They talk about it once you start digging into like the Slack chats. So definitely join the Kubernetes Slack chat. People in there are actual practitioners. They're going to help give you real world advice instead of marketing advice, that you might read on a blog, and that is on sort of what I would call the hype train of everything is wonderful and everything is perfect. So definitely do that. For my students and people I consult with and people that I train and workshop to on a weekly, if not monthly basis, my advice always to them is try Swarm first. You can learn it in a day. You can learn the basics in a day, and you can get it ready in less than a week, as long as you have good, solid Docker knowledge. That is not true for Kubernetes. So if you can get away with using Swarm with half the effort or a third of the effort, then why go to the complexity and scale that's necessary for Kubernetes? It's designed to be very large infrastructure deployments, not necessarily for a 10 node, or even a 50 node deployment. That Swarm works great for that kind of stuff. So obviously there's a whole lot of nuances in there, and I am someone who helps teams remove complexity from projects so that they can get agile and go faster, right? That's the whole thing about DevOps, reducing complexity, improving automation. And so if I see people choosing any tool that is really complicated and that they're doing it the hard way, I'm always going to advise them to try to find the easy path, which is why like a lot of people nowadays use Ansible, and, for example, in a totally different context, people are leaving Python and Chef for Ansible and SaltStack because those tools are easier. Terraform is a lot easier to use and might solve a lot of the problems that you maybe had to use with Python before, not Python, but with Puppet before, Puppet or Chef. So for the same reason those tools are full features but also very complicated, people are using easier tools like Terraform and maybe some Ansible to make it easy to deploy something that was previously hard to do. I feel like right now we're living in a bubble, and a lot of people are choosing Kubernetes because it's talked about a lot, not because it makes technical sense for their project. And so I am here to give advice and recommendations based on my experience, my customers' experience, students that I talk to. Anyway, so great questions. Rodrigo says, hey, Brett, have you configured Rexray to use Azure storage? I've tried a tutorial found on Rexray blog with no luck. So I have used Rexray on Azure. but it has been, quite frankly, it has been a year, so I don't know the current status of it. Um, so I can't say it worked a year ago. I haven't tried it since then because I don't have any Swarm projects that are using that. There might actually be someone in chat about that. Um, but if you, I don't have any help for you on that specifically. If you want to hook me up on, if you're in the Slack chat with Docker Mastery, or if you're on Twitter, feel free to ping me there. Maybe point me to what you're reading, and I can actually try it for you and see if we can figure out the bug or look at what maybe your issue is further. Rob is back with following on Rodrigo's question. Can you explain more about Rexray and storage in general for those of us who are confused about the topic of storage? So sure, out of the box, Rexray think of Rexray as a storage orchestrator. It makes sure that you get the storage you need from wherever it's at to the server that your container is going to run on, and makes sure that it's there before your container starts. So Rexray is really great for Swarm because Swarm out of the box only has a driver for local storage, for persistence of databases and stuff like that. So you don't normally need it for your app servers or your web servers or your proxies, but you usually need persistent storage for your databases or your key value stores and stuff like that. So the first thing you need to do is figure out where in your storage, what storage you're going to use, right? Are you going to use a cloud storage? Do you have a storage on-prem? Because there's not necessarily out of the box a storage provider that's going to magically work across all your servers and replicate everything. Like, that's not built out of the box, and those things are, quite frankly, really hard to do. So you need to figure out your storage provider, and then you need to figure out how to get your container to talk to that storage. And so with Swarm, that is Rexray. So Rexray is an open source project by Dell, and it plugs into Docker and Swarm and works right out of the box. Let me see if I have dog versus cat. So I have this repo, Rob, if you're not aware, this thing called dog versus cat. And it's basically, imagine if you did DigitalOcean as your provider, and then you used Rexray and DigitalOcean's block storage. That's their off-server disk storage. And then you try to deploy a bunch of different apps. This actually deploys 3 different apps. One of them is an in-tier app and multi-tier app, and then the 2 other ones, well, actually 2 of them are multi-tier apps. But it's a bunch of apps. And I use this now in a lot of my talks and demos because in fact, there's actually a video to the link to one of the videos right there in there. So github.com/BrettFisher/dog versus cat. And that is a working repo of using storage with Rexray. And it's really not that hard. Basically, with Docker and Swarm, and I know I'm focusing on that because that's where I spend most of my time with Rexray specifically. You install a plugin to Docker, and so this simple little file that's called stack Rexray would actually deploy a Docker service in Swarm that would install the plugin on every single node. And then that way, it's really easy if you just say, like, I'm going to deploy a Ghost blog and I need database storage. So then you would basically do this. You would create a volume like you normally would, but you would opt for a different driver. And that driver would be the Rexray DigitalOcean block storage driver. And I told it that I wanted a gig size volume, and then back up in your apps, you just connect them like that, like you would a normal volume. So out of the box, Docker and Swarm provides a local volume, and that volume means that the storage will only be on the local machine of the server that the container is running on. And if that container has to go somewhere else, that's where you get into problems because that storage is only on that host. I hope that answers that question. If not, basically, storage is something you need to think about if you have persistent data. I wouldn't shy away from it. I wouldn't say don't do containers for storage because lots of people do. It's fine. It works great. But it's another layer of complexity you need to worry about. So I would say your first day in container land and in container orchestrators, do web services, do web proxies, do app servers. Sort of leave the persistent storage out of it for day one and let yourself learn, right? Going real production stuff, and then make your next project maybe the persistent storage if you're going to try to go large and complex. Storage is hard. Persistent storage is hard. Databases are hard in any system on the internet or in a data center. So I'm not saying that containers suddenly makes it exceptionally more harder. It's just hard to begin with. I always in every project prefer to use the cloud's databases. If that cloud vendor, if you're all in on Amazon, you should be using their RDS solutions for databases. Right? Why do you want to run your own databases? Do you think you have better expertise in running databases than AWS does? I mean, they provide automatic backups and failover clusters and all that complexity that you don't have to worry about. So typically, most teams I will advise, let's use the cloud vendors because they're going to do a better job of it than you. And then that way, your container orchestrator doesn't have to worry so much about persistent storage. In my talks and in my slides, I talk about persistent storage. So if you happen to catch me live at a conference, you're going to always hear me talk about that. In my Swarm course, that is one of the next few sections that I will talk about in my Swarm course as I keep updating that. But you can get a preview of that by just trying out and watching the videos here on this repo for Dog versus Cat. Because Dog versus Cat I did at DockerCon this year, and it talks about persistent storage, and I deploy container apps with persistent storage on DigitalOcean with Swarm. So hopefully that helps, Rob. Hello from Brazil. This is Marco Hetrian. Hopefully I said that close to correct. Marco Hetrian. Hello from Brazil. Well, hello back. Similar time zones, just totally different part of the world. Santosh, any timelines on your Kubernetes course? So, great question. I do not give out deadlines or timelines because they drive me insane, and quite frankly, I'm usually very wrong at them. My goal is end of year, but that may not happen. It's no guarantee. We're just starting working on the content now, and it usually takes me at least several months to create all of that because there's a lot of people that I work with. The team is now over 5. I think we're now at 6 people or so across all the different parts of the course and how to get it all working. So it takes a team to make those big courses like that. And we're not going to do a small Kubernetes course. This is going to be a large, complete Kubernetes course. So when it comes out, I will let you know. Vladimir question, hi, how do you run cron jobs in Swarm? What is the right way of doing it? And Lee says, oh, by the way, thanks for the stream quality. Yeah, I kind of try to watch the stats, and it complains every once in a while, but yeah, thanks. All right, so for Vladimir's question, how do you run cron jobs? So this was a question last week. I would say look at this dog versus cat repo for the way that Swarm does it. Kubernetes has a jobs object, and basically Kubernetes has something built in out of the box as a primitive that you can look at, and there are higher level tools that maybe would go on top of that. In Swarm, it's not as obvious, so out of the box, there is no sort of batch job cron worker. What I like to do is break down what people would traditionally do in cron into multiple types of work. The first type is where you just need to run something once, like, for example, a Docker plugin that you need to install on all your servers. And I show examples of that in this dog versus cat repo where I actually go in and I do this Rexray install. So I create a Swarm service this is under the file stack-rexray YAML. And that is an example of a one-time sort of cron job on every node when it joins the Swarm. I'm going to put that link in the chat here. And then another example I have is on what if you need something to run daily across every node in a cluster. That would be my example here, which is the prune. So this is a simple bash command. So once a day. So that one is me showing an example of how you can have a Docker, a Swarm service run on every node, because I'm doing it in global mode here. Sorry for the small text, but global mode. And this global mode means that every node will run one container of this. And I do a simple, easy bash one-liner that says every day, essentially, in sleep for a day of seconds, and then once a day, run the Docker image prune command to clean up my storage of my Docker images. So I always put that in Swarm. It doesn't really matter when it runs, so it doesn't have to be as complicated as what a true jobs engine would be. It just needs to run once a day. So these are simple examples that sometimes people need out of the box, and then they start looking for a really fancy cron system to do this kind of work. If I needed this to run once an hour, but I didn't really care when it ran once an hour, I could just change the sleep value on that. And of course, this command you can have this dump any comments or anything you want. You can have this run a shell script. You can have it dump comments out to your log, so you can see in logging for that. Now, from here, you can obviously do things like run cron in a container. I try not to do that because cron in a container doesn't. Cron itself doesn't have a multi-server awareness, right? So it only has awareness of its current system. And in a container, it only have awareness of the container it's in. So then when I get to people that say, well, I need this to run in my app, and I need to run it once per app. So I will start looking at us making that, like maybe they're in Ruby or they're in PHP, and they need to run a worker process, once an hour. So I will look at doing that inside their app, and their app sometimes has scheduling functionality built in, and I will have that just run as part of their app. So if it's a PHP worker, then it will just run a PHP worker command, and maybe I will connect persistent storage to it so that it can at least check to see when it's run, or maybe it'll have a key value store that's behind it. That's more of an distributed app architecture question at that point. For higher level cron jobs, like you just want a cron job system and you want to be able to write commands to run on any node once a day on any node, not multiple times a day or not on every node, stuff like that. Then you can look at stuff like jobs as a service. There's actually, let me look at my bookmarks. Jobs as a service is a sample of how to do that on Swarm. JAAS. This is from Alex Ellis, who also runs the Open FAS project. So that's another project of his. So functions as a service, which technically you could be running functions as a job. There are other job runners for Swarm. So I think I have actually a whole bunch of other ones. I know some people have used Rundeck, which is not specifically a container solution, but there's something called Swarm Scheduler, not very popular. There's a lot of people talking about how to do that as first-class citizens in Swarm. So you could look on that for just Google Moby, issue 23880. That's something that you can look at. There's something called Quartermaster that didn't really take off, although it is a pretty cool idea of managing functions as a cron job solution. There's another one from Victor, one of the Docker captains, that actually is called Docker Flow Cron that you can check out. Again, if you're missing all these, you can always pause the video and back up a little bit to write them down or whatever. So I won't put all these links in chat. But Jobs as a Service is probably one of the more popular ones. And then there's also one I've heard of called Tasker that can work straight Docker or Swarm. For Kubernetes, I don't have any customers running a third-party job service. I know people that use the built-in jobs functionality that comes with Kubernetes out of the box. So check that out. Hopefully that gives you a chance to check some of that stuff out. Most people try a solution, and if it works for them, they just go with that one. They don't really care about the higher level, which one is the perfect one and trying on them all. It's kind of a simple thing to get working. So it either works for you or it doesn't. All right. So Brazilian, yes. Oh, do we have multiple Brazilians in here? It's fantastic. Well, it is the right time zone for that, right? So I try to change my time zones up so we can also get India and, Ukraine and stuff like that in here because I want to make sure we give everybody a chance. So everyone's saying hi, hello, Rodrigo, Alfonso, hello. Swagatam, I'm not sure if that's how you say that correctly. Hello. Hopefully that's close. Didn't butcher that name too much. Hello there. Hope you're well. One question: how do we integrate Ansible Tower with Docker Job? I'm not sure what you mean by Ansible Tower with Docker Job. What's a Docker Job? So I don't know. Ask me that question not sure if you're asking about Tower and Swarm, or I know of Tower. I don't use Tower, so I'm not sure if you have specific questions. If you look for a Tower, the first thing I'd always do, obviously, is go to Docker Hub and search for a product there and see if someone's already come up with. Yeah, so we got this guy, 14, 20 stars. So these people have some Ansible Towers. 100,000 pulls, that's a pretty popular one. 10,000 pulls, 500,000 pulls. So it looks like there's a lot of people making Tower inside a container already. So you might want to check some of those out. I don't know if it doesn't look like any of those are really from official. But this particular person has a pretty popular one. So you might want to just search that on Docker Hub at first. I don't have one off the top of my head, so hopefully that helps. Lee, thanks for answering my question about RBAC. As a relative newbie, it's good to hear a seasoned pro say that things aren't easy and that it's wise to use higher level tools sometimes. Yes, absolutely. The makers of Kubernetes are on regular occasions saying that it was designed as a low level tool for higher level tools to be built on top of it. So I would say let's try to use it that way, the way they intended, by finding those higher level tools that you prefer. I found it easier to get started with plain Jane K8s than it was to get started with Helm, and never got Helm fully working. Is it the case that a Helm K8s installer just hasn't been released yet? Rob, so your question on Helm versus K8s, right? So Helm is not. So first off, Helm is not always needed, and Helm, yes, you want to get. You actually want to learn the basics of Helm, or of Kubernetes before you try to deploy Helm. I would prefer using Helm with a higher level tool, even though Helm itself is that higher level tool. It is its own complicated. I wish I had a Helm course for you. I don't, to get working with Helm. So I'm not sure what your actual issues were getting Helm working properly, but definitely you want to be able to deploy a multi-node K8s cluster and just creating service definitions and creating those in Kubernetes and deploying them. You can actually, if you're on Docker desktop for Mac or Windows, it's got Kubernetes now built in, so you can enable Kubernetes there and use Docker command lines to interact with Kubernetes. You can actually do Docker stack deploy to even deploy a compose file that you might be playing with. So you want to get that basic functionality down before you actually start going and playing with Helm, because Helm itself is complicated, and yeah, it can be hard to learn all that at once. So I wouldn't be surprised if you did struggle, because I would struggle if I was trying to learn Helm first and not Kubernetes. I'm not sure how far you are in your Kubernetes learning. So Rob, again, for your clients, do you like to launch one new cluster for each new client, or put multiple clients into shared clusters? When I use Heroku, I'm not yet using containers. I'm still doing Git deploys. Yeah, so that's the sweet spot for Heroku, right? Is Git deploys. That's where it's designed to be. Since they do offer containers, you can do that. But I find Heroku just works better if I'm not on a container project. But I always do container projects now, so I tend to use Heroku less and less. To answer your question on clients on multiple clusters. So my role in most teams is I do not house their apps on my servers. I don't have servers for them. They have their own team and their own servers, and they usually bring me in as a part of, to just sort of augment their team to help them get over the hurdles of learning containers and doing container stuff. So I have never had two different clients on the same cluster, and quite frankly, that is a hard problem to get right in terms of security, right? So if you're going to have multiple customers running on the same swarm, that's fine. But if they expect to have any access to their own stuff or to be able to deploy their own stuff, whether you're doing Kubernetes or Swarm, that is going to be a hard thing to do, just because the management of multi-tenancy is what that's known as in the industry. Multi-tenancy is a hard problem, and you can certainly do it. I think that if you're going to do that, you probably want to go the Kubernetes route, learn Kubernetes in and out, and then get a higher level tool that's designed for multi-tenancy on top of that. I don't really have any off the top of my head that I know could do that. I'm sure that some like OpenShift might be able to do it. I know Docker Enterprise Edition allows some level of multi-tenancy, but I'm not sure if it's designed for that kind of model that you're looking at. It's more of it definitely is an enterprisey tool, but I know that you can give people read-only access through Docker Enterprise, for example, to Kubernetes or Swarm or both. And then you can give them access to just specific containers so they can administrate that. So you definitely need those higher level tools. And I don't do that for customers because usually they have their own team that is already designing their servers, building their servers, and they just need someone to help them through the DevOps workflow and how do we automate containers, how do we properly build container images, stuff like that. So I haven't had a need to do the multi-tenancy for that. It's a good question, though. Raiku says, as a managed service and infrastructure, as a service provider, I'm personally struggling to find uses for containers where we can help automate service delivery, i.e. managed Windows and Linux. Any ideas? So let's see. Oh, I think I'm going to continue your question here. Most of these things we do are adding software to monitor, manage, and troubleshoot OS issues. We do application managed as managed SQL, managed Oracle, and the like. We generate a Windows server template that we use to deploy to customer hybrid cloud environments. So yeah, so you're in a Raiku, for you, yeah, containers aren't for everything. So in that case, you're not going to deploy Windows Server 26. Like, okay, so first off, containers aren't really going to help you for anything older than Windows Server 2016 because 2016 was the first version to even run containers. You wouldn't run a full Windows OS in a container. That's not a thing. That's what VMs are for. What you would do, though, is if you were deploying IIS apps, for example, on Windows, or you needed to deploy Apache apps or something like that, those things would go in containers. If you needed to make automation tools and monitoring tools work, those things would go in containers, and then they would either run on Windows Server 2016 or a full Linux VM. That's how you would do that. So great question, though. For Windows, if you think about Windows, it's probably a couple years behind in any situation because Windows didn't get into the container game until late 2016, really. And now they just released Windows Server 2019, and it's supposed to have even more container features, work better out of the box with Kubernetes, I hear. I haven't actually tested that yet, so I don't have any hard facts on that. But if you're going to be looking at sort of the 2019 stuff, that might be able to solve more of your problems. If I was you, I would probably look at running my tool sets, my monitoring tools, my automation tools, my deployment tools. I would run those in containers because then you can ship those along with their configurations. Like if you have a team of people that are all managing their own configurations and you need to be able to say, hey, we need to run this automation tool version 5.0 over here. That is really great stuff for running in containers, and that does work on Windows containers or Linux containers. So that's the kind of thing where I would develop those things in containers locally, then I would ship them in container images to a registry like Docker Hub, and then anyone in my team could download those tools and automatically have them and deploy them, and use them rather as like command line tools from any system without having to have a whole bunch of stuff set up. And in fact, if you think of your deployment tools as like their own little development environment, when you're making them and managing them and creating them and versioning them, think of that and think, that's one of the great things about Docker is that containers allows you to easily set up development environments. And I would argue that it also allows you to set up easy tooling environments too. For example, I have something called NetShoot. Now, I didn't make this because I stole it from an actual Docker engineer that made something called NetShoot. But if I looked in my own repos here, I have a tool called NetShoot. I actually pulled it out of GitHub from someone else. I forked it. And what this is a whole bunch of Linux tools, network troubleshooting tools, system tools that I throw in one big image. And then I can run that from anywhere. So for example, at the command line, if I'm sitting on a server or I'm on someone else's machine and I need to do a dig command, so then I can just do like a docker run -it to get me the shell. And then I can do a Brett Fisher slash netshoot and sh and get myself right inside that container as a new container, and then I can do like a drill command on brettfisher.com. Now that drill tool, and that drill tool's not even in mine. That's a horrible example. Let's see if we have lookup. Okay, I don't know why I don't have drill in there. So ns lookup on brettfisher.com. So like that ns lookup might not be on all Linux servers, or it might even might not be on Windows on that particular version because it's a core machine, Windows Core without all the tools. Or if I needed to do something like do I have AB? Yeah, so like Apache Bench, which is a benchmarking tool, or HTTP Ping, which is a tool that's like Ping but for websites. So I can do a HTTP Ping of brettfisher.com. I don't have that installed either. All right, bad example. Actually, I think I have my own dedicated tool for that. So I actually would do Docker run it Brett Fisher. I think I have this one. Okay, let's see if this works. Live demos, always fun. So yeah, so I created a container image just about this tool, and the reason I put it in its own image is because it acts like a command line for me, and I can do this. This is basically pinging an HTTP website from a machine, kind of like Ping would, but it's actually using HTTP instead of the ICMP protocol. Another tool I might do is ingrep for network watching, like watching packets coming over a network. That's in here. So there's a whole lot of tools like that in here. I got that idea from someone else, and that allows me to use those tools anywhere. So even if you're just a troubleshooter or an ops person, I still think containers is a great thing to use. Great question. All right, so we're going to start wrapping this up. I'm going to go through 3 or 4 more questions, and we'll summarize the end, and then I'll remind you about what's coming up with Docker stuff. So let's see. Rob, we'll have to listen to your answers later because of overlapping meeting I have to catch. All right, Rob, I'll see you soon. Ilyas, I'm not sure if that's how I'm pronouncing your name. Yeah. Oh, yeah. You said that already. You're generating the images. Hopefully debugging question. More like debugging apps and services running on containers and orchestrators like K8s or Swarm. So hopefully you just saw me do the NetShoot thing. The next thing I would say is go through some of the slides in container training. So I run an open source repo of slides that I teach in my real world courses. These slides are also they also sort of provide my paid courses on Udemy, but those paid courses have a lot more to them, and they're there's obviously the videos and all that stuff. So you can go on this container training page, and if you scroll all the way to the bottom, you'll see slides down there of all this stuff. And so you can actually jump on those slides for the Docker, the Swarm, and the Kubernetes, and you can look through the slide topics. So actually, let me back out of that one. Let me go to this one for the Swarm one. And if you go through some of the slides, they're all HTML slides, and you will see in there, let's see, there's some troubleshooting stuff. Debugging tools, SwarmKit debugging tools, for example, this whole chapter on them. So sorry I made you wait so long on the answer for that. So if you're looking into troubleshooting tools, there's really 2 types of troubleshooting. One is just troubleshooting the Kubernetes misbehaving itself or Swarm misbehaving themselves, and that really is one part you knowing how that thing works, and then obviously learning a few tools that actually can speak to that application in a way that makes sense about troubleshooting. However, most people, they don't actually need that first. They need to learn how to troubleshoot distributed systems. Distributed systems, whether they're in containers or not, require a whole new set of skills around how do I troubleshoot across server. Things that are now on the TCP layers get more complicated than all your stuff on one server. So I mentioned earlier things like ingrep, HTTP Ping, Apache Bench. Those tools are all in this course or also in my courses and my videos. So look around. Some of those things are mentioned on my Docker page over here on brettfisher.com/Docker. And hopefully you can play with some of those. It would be a great idea, thanks for the idea on this, to maybe just make a troubleshooting course that's a shorter one, maybe a 2 to 3 hour troubleshooting course that is just me going through some tools like that. And maybe I'll get time to make that next year, and we'll be talking about it. Carrie says, I met LCal. It already exists, but is not officially supported released. Right. Yeah, lcal is still running Linux containers on Windows in a Linux VM. So if you're going to do it on server, it's still got to have Hyper-V installed, and so that technically means you're running virtualization. I believe it works in Windows 10. I'm not sure. I think it does work on 1803, if I remember correctly. Don't quote me on that. I actually have some slides on that. If you jump into the container training slides in here and go back to the first one, in case you're curious, there are some Docker for Windows slides. I'm also working on some videos for the Docker Mastery course on Windows container stuff. I just don't have them finished yet, so sorry for the delay on that. Just making too many videos at once, essentially, for too many topics. Yeah, John says, Portainer is a good GUI for Swarm. I agree. Portainer is fantastic. Thanks for suggesting that. Portainer is a good Swarm GUI. That's portainer.io, Portainer. That's a great free GUI for Swarm and just for Docker in general. It does work without Swarm. It now supports multi-Swarm and multi-Docker host. It's really cool, so that you can actually aggregate all your stuff up. John says, I did technical analysis of orchestrators, including sending two of us for official Docker Enterprise training. We chose Swarm. Interesting choice, John. Thank you for the feedback on that. I would love to. I'm assuming that you still like it. So if you have any other information on how it's going, I would love to hear that on Twitter or in Slack if you're in the Slack chat for my courses. Olivia said everything. I don't know. Okay. I don't know what that means. Joshua, hello. You're always joining my Slacks, my AMAs. On a single node swarm with a host that has multiple public IP addresses bound to one or more NICs, is it possible to have multiple containers bound to the specific IP address such that outgoing traffic from each of those containers will go out on different IP addresses? Ooh. Well, the host that has multiple public IP addresses bound to one or more NICs, is it possible to have multiple containers bind to a specific, I have to read this over, sorry, specific IP address such that outgoing traffic from each of those containers will go out on different addresses? So outbound traffic. So, okay, on Swarm, that's a different answer for Swarm than Docker. And you're saying on a single node Swarm. So on Swarm, the outgoing address is going to be the default gateway. I don't believe, using the default overlay driver, I don't believe that is possible to have different outbound different outbound IPs for traffic going out. Because they're basically, when you do the Swarm init, you're choosing the data traffic, the data channel, or data plane rather, and the data plane is going to use one Ethernet interface, and I don't know that you can control the IP on that interface if it's got multiple IPs. So you might have to look at a different, either the host network or doing a Mac VLAN or possibly using Weave networking. I don't have answers on top of my head on how to do that. I know that it would work on Mac VLAN, but that doesn't work in most cloud providers other than, well, actually, I don't know any cloud provider that supports Mac VLAN because it requires that you use an external DHCP and you give multiple IPs. I don't know. So that's a good question. Let's talk offline in Slack or something. I don't have an immediate answer for that. On host networking, probably. You probably could do that, but then that's going to also be limited. I guess with having multiple IPs, I guess you're already not in the cloud unless you're, I guess maybe in Azure and Amazon, you could assign multiple IPs, but I don't know that you can actually on the same NIC. You'd have to have multiple NICs. I don't know. That's a great question. That gets really complicated really fast, so we'd have to look at that because I don't know off the top of my head. Thanks for the hard one. You always pick the questions I don't have the answers to. That's not true. Actually, I have lots of good questions from you. All right. Biker. Okay, so this is going to be the last couple of questions, and then we're going to end it for the day. Brett, I just set up Docker EE with Swarm. You were here last week, Biker, I remember. and running in a day on Azure, no less, now trying to bring the developers on board. They have only used Git and Bamboo to deploy. Would like recommendations for a Drupal development environment that would work well with deployment process. One recommendation was Lagoon. Wadby was a little more complicated than I needed. That was Docker for Drupal. Okay, so I am not a Drupal person. I did put Drupal in my course as an example, but I do not run Drupal environments. I am not a Drupal developer. So that is probably not a good question for me. I would say a deployment process is, to me, when I hear deployment process, I think I have a swarm and I need a CI/CD tool to do my testing, integration, and deployment. Docker EE is not that tool. You would need a different tool. But I think of things like Jenkins, Travis, CodeShip, Drone.io. There's lots of stuff like that. So all the ones you mentioned there, Lagoon, Woodby or Wadby, I've never heard of those things. So maybe those are specific to Docker, specific to Drupal, and I wouldn't know the answers to those questions. So if that doesn't help, I know you're in the Docker Mastery chat, so feel free to ask me a slightly different question or expand on your question in chat because we're running out of time here. But thanks for showing up again, and I'm sorry I didn't have the answer to that question. Aspen, is DockerCon worth attending versus watching screencasts later? I will make this I will have 2 more questions after this. So is DockerCon worth attending? I would say yes, absolutely. It's my favorite conference of the year. However, realize that a conference today is not about going to because of the sessions. I mean, yes, you go there for sessions, but the real reason you go is community. So conferences in physical form, because they're so expensive to go to, I always go for the community. I meet people, I go to sessions where I have a specific project dealing with that problem, and then I will stay late and ask questions of the person speaking. They usually hang out afterwards. So then I get access to these industry experts, and I can talk to them. I can probably ask them to meet with them later. For example, when I go to DockerCon, I set up times where people can come and hang out with me and ask specific questions about Docker and Swarm and Slack and all that stuff. Or not Slack, but Docker, Swarm, Compose, DevOps stuff. And so people come and hang out with me, and we talk about their projects. That's the reason to go to conferences, not because you get to watch videos in real time. Obviously, having access to vendors is a nice benefit if you want to look through the vendor ecosystem, trying to figure out if you need new tooling that you want to pay for. But I absolutely talk about community. When you go to DockerCon, only half of the stuff that's going on at DockerCon is in the sessions. The other half is happening in what they call the Friends track, where Docker Friends, where you get to go and meet other Docker experts and chat with them live, like in a group session. They have multiple ways to network constantly throughout the conference. You have evening activities where you're going to meet, experts that are running different software companies and all that. So those are the reasons I go to conferences. I honestly, when I go to DockerCon, I may only see like 3 sessions at most, because most of the time I'm there talking with people I met last year, talking about projects with people, helping other people, stuff like that. So that's the reason, not the screencast. I then come back home and watch the screencast later that I missed from the event. So hopefully that'll help. You're welcome for the Rexray plugin, Adrian. You're welcome, Vladimir, Alfonso. Oh, I don't know what that message is. It says redacted. Chris says, my last question about putting a WordPress stack on Swarm. I have 3 clients that want a WordPress stack. I can have 3 different sites on a Swarm cluster with 1 IP. Is that bad? No, that's great. Totally. That's why orchestration exists, is so you can run multiple things at the same time. If your clients don't need access to the containers or anything like that, then you maybe want to set up a single Swarm, and you can just deploy the same stack or the same compose file 3 times over, Chris. And that totally will work. In front of that, you would use something like Traffic. So Traffic is a really great proxy. Nginx is also a good proxy, but you need one that can speak your orchestrator. So you need a proxy tool that does Swarm if you're on Swarm, or speaks Kubernetes if you're on Kubernetes. If you're just doing the WordPress 3 times, I absolutely would do this. The fastest way to deploy is to look at my repo right here. Not that one, sorry. My dog versus cat, wherever that's at. My dog versus cat repo. because you could use a lot of the scripts and automation out of here on DigitalOcean with a 3-node swarm. You can get a coupon in my courses for DigitalOcean to give you some free credits, deploy 3 nodes so it'll be fault tolerant, and then use these sample scripts and the sample YAML files to set up your Rexray storage for the databases. And if these are small sites, I'm assuming they're not going to be like millions and millions of viewers a month. So it's going to be relatively easy for you to run databases for WordPress. And then you can just redeploy that WordPress stack over and over again and use this one actually uses traffic on the front end. And so what you'll notice is like on here, when I deploy Ghost, which is a competitor to WordPress, I actually specify the traffic port that it listens on for Ghost, and then the front end rule, and then traffic for me. It's so cool. This is so cool what it does. It will go to Let's Encrypt, automatically get me an SSL certificate, automatically update traffic, and then reroute all the traffic for that DNS name to the proper container service for my apps, which means I can have one IP address and a load balancer for all the sites, but each one of them is automatic SSL and routing to wherever they need to. And I can run hundreds of websites that way. I mean, unlimited numbers as long as you keep scaling up your servers. So totally check that out, Chris, if you're still on. That is probably your fastest deployment option. I don't have a WordPress example, but you can probably find a good compose file for WordPress elsewhere and start using that compose file based on my information from this repo. Bamboo is the Jenkins. Okay. Okay. Yeah, so Biker, Bamboo, I'm sure that's fine. All of them speak Docker at this point. All the CI/CD tools speak Docker. So it's really about what fits your workflow and your price range and all that stuff. They will all, you're basically just going to have those things SSHing into servers and running Docker commands for you. So, and then David, second to last question. Hey, Brett, first off, thank you for all your hard work and help. You're the man. Thank you, David. Secondly, I'm really struggling to pass in a file continents via arg to build. You're welcome, Chris. David, I'm really struggling to pass in a file contents via arg at build. So I'm not sure what you mean in terms of you can't just echo. I don't know what file contents. I don't have a quick answer for that one, unfortunately, and we've kind of run out of time. So if you can hit me up, if you're in the chat for Slack, feel free to meet me in the Docker Mastery Slack chat, or on Twitter if you're not in there, and then we can go back and forth on Twitter. Arguments are going to be limited to what you can fit in an environment variable, so it might not be appropriate for the file contents in an argument. I would say what I would probably do is work with you and talk to you about, if you were like a consulting client, I would talk to you about what's in the file contents, if it's even appropriate to do as an argument. Maybe if it's a configuration file, quite often that configuration file only has a certain number of values that you need to actually change. So you really don't need the whole file. You really just need different arguments inside there that you can pass as individual environment variables. So and you're doing this at build time. It might be better to do this at runtime. I'm not sure why you can't just, if you're doing it as an argument at build time, why you can't just make it as a copy command inside the build. I would do a copy of a file before I would try to stick it in an argument. I'm not sure what advantage you get with the argument, so we would have to talk about that. If you're doing it you want to do it so that you can have different things at runtime, you want to do that at runtime with something like a swarm config and a swarm secret. Those things allow you to inject files at runtime on swarm automatically, and you don't even need them in your image because you're going to provide them when the container starts up. So hopefully that gives you some help, David. Otherwise, jump on the other two things I mentioned to find me later. If you want to expand it, you can also go to my GitHub AMA and just ask it as a very specific question about arguments, and you can get really detailed in there inside of GitHub. So thanks everybody for coming. Again, check out my Docker resources. So much of this stuff is listed in there. I keep adding more stuff to this. This is my best coupons on my courses, which we're working on the third one and fourth one now. And then obviously all of my upcoming live trainings in case you're going to conferences, and all my things on the internet like Twitch and this YouTube channel, other GitHub repos and free tools that I've made or help other people make, and me on all the socials. So thanks again, everyone, for coming. I will be back here next week on Thursday. We will have another one of these AMAs. So bring me, again, your easy and your hard questions. We will talk more about orchestration and all that stuff. And I will see you on the internet.